Now let's look at the different cell types of the stomach that are associated with gastric secretions. Now there's 5 different secretory cells, 5 different cells of the stomach that produces some kind of secretion. 4 of the 5 gastric cell types produces approximately 3 liters of gastric juices per day. The remaining 1 cell type, which is the last one we're going to be looking at, is actually a hormone producing cell. Okay, so why don't we take a look at the different cell types, where they're located, what their basic functions are, and let's get started. So let's look at this picture here. And this picture, what we're looking at, this top one picture, this is basically a broader cross-section view of the stomach. The lumen of the stomach is way up in the top here. And what we're going to be looking at is this region and the associated cells that line that region. That region is called a gastric pit. And this is where all the different cell types are going to be located. So the 5 different secretory cells are going to be located in the gastric pits. So now let's look at, starting at the more surface area, the luminal side, okay? So the first cell type is going to be a surface mucus cell. So let's just do here. So let's do number 1. Okay, and the surface mucus cell, that's going to be the orange lining in here. Okay, now the key word on here is going to be mucus, obviously. So now you know it is going to secrete mucin. Mucin plus water equals mucus. Okay, so it lines the inside of the stomach and it starts to dip down into the gastric pit. So you can see those cells are starting to line the opening of the gastric pit. Now, this secretion is alkaline. Boy, that's just a really bad spelling of this. So let me... It's an alkaline product, and then the mucin, once it combines with water, will account for about a 1 to 3 millimeter thickness of mucus lining the stomach wall. Okay, now the mucus, or the mucin in this area, along with a fast turnover of cells of the stomach, help to keep the stomach lining healthy. Okay, because if you have a lower turnover rate of cells, then because of the acidic environment, they are prone to more damage that could lead into ulcers. And if you didn't have much mucus, that acidic content of the stomach could also damage the cells. Okay, the second one is going to be mucus neck. And the mucus neck cell, let me do a different color so we can kind of follow these along. The mucus neck cell, let me go around here. That's going to be right this area, and that's going to be accounting for those cells. Now, the interesting thing with the mucus neck cell, one, it's a little bit deeper in the pit than the surface mucus cells, but this one produces not an alkaline, but acidic secretion. Okay, now the acidic secretion helps to maintain the acidic environment that is produced by hydrochloric acid. Okay, now hydrochloric acid is going to be produced by the next cell type that we're going to talk about. Now both both types of mucus, from the surface mucus as well as the mucus neck cells, both of those mucus, or the mucin, is protecting the stomach from abrasion or other mechanical injuries. So where does the well, let me go one more thing, get to the third one. So I might as well do this within red. 3 is going to be parietal cells. Now this is going to be the next cell type. No, I don't want this one here. So the next cell type is the parietal cells. I want to make sure I get spelt this right. Parietal cells. And there's actually 2 different secretions. One is intrinsic factor. And I am putting an asterisk on that one, okay? Intrinsic factor is, or the production of the intrinsic factor is the only essential function of stomach. Okay, so what is intrinsic factor? We've talked about this in the past. Intrinsic factor is required for vitamin B12 absorption. Vitamin B12 is absorbed in the ileum, I-L-E-U-M, not an I-U-M, but an E-U-M, which is your distal end of the small intestine. So duodenum, jejunum, ileum, then we get into the cecum of the large intestine, okay? So vitamin B12 is absorbed there. Vitamin B12 is essential for red blood cell production or erythrocyte production. So if you do not have intrinsic factor, if you have gastric issues or whatever the condition is, you're not producing intrinsic factor, you could wind up having a condition called pernicious anemia, okay? The other thing that the parietal cells produce is hydrochloric acid. Okay? Let me put a disclaimer on this one. They don't secrete, parietal cells don't secrete hydrochloric acid. They secrete hydrogen ions and chloride ions. If it was to secrete hydrochloric acid, it would actually destroy the cell. So it secretes hydrogen, chloride, then once they're secreted out, they combine to form hydrochloric acid. Okay, so let's take a little closer look at this. Let me lower this down. Let's look at a little closer look, and this is going to be a parietal cell in the center, just to show you kind of what I'm talking about here. So in order to get hydrochloric acid as your end product, you combine the hydrogen and chloride ions. So where does the hydrogen and chloride ions come from? Well, first of all, chloride just diffuses out of your bloodstream, because remember when we even talked about like the bicarbonate ion in the blood, that when the bicarbonate goes out of the red blood cells and gets transported in the plasma, chloride goes into the red blood cell. So here's where the chloride comes from. It essentially just diffuses across the parietal cell. It doesn't just diffuse, it just comes across and is secreted into the lumen of the stomach. So where's the hydrogen come from? Hydrogen, remember we talked about the bicarbonate. That's your end product of this. So we have water. Let me go to green on this one so you can see it. So we have water in the cell. Water dissociates into a hydrogen ion and a hydroxyl group, that OH. The hydroxyl group combines with CO2 to give you the bicarbonate. So that's how the bicarbonate makes its way into the bloodstream. But the hydrogen ion that's just floating around out here actually is put into the lumen of the stomach by a hydrogen potassium pump, and then the hydrogen comes out, binds with the chloride ion to give you hydrochloric acid. So that's the parietal cell in a nutshell. Now, what does hydrochloric acid do? Hydrochloric acid, so let me go back to black on this one. So hydrochloric acid basically breaks down the cell wall structure of, let's say, plants. Okay, so hydrochloric hydrochloric acid helps to break down that plant cell wall. It denatures proteins. Okay, so denaturing. So you have a protein, which is a whole bunch of peptide groups that's really wound tight and so forth. It starts to unwind them. Okay, that's what denaturing is. It starts to unwind that protein. Doesn't do the digestion yet, but denatures it. And it creates hydrochloric acid, which everybody knows here, helps to lower the pH of your gastric content, which is responsible for converting pepsinogen into pepsin. We'll get that on the next cell type. So pepsinogen into pepsin. So those are your basic functions of the hydrochloric acid. So let's go back to this section. And I think, okay, now we're on number 4. Let me just scroll down here. Number 4, let's go back to black. The 4th cell type is a chief cell. And chief cells secrete what we just talked about, pepsinogen. This is an inactive enzyme that is going to be associated with the digestion of protein. But this is just it's a precursor. So the pepsinogen has to be activated. Now, what activates pepsinogen? You should be able to remember this one because we just talked about it, and that's going to be hydrochloric acid. So HCl converts pepsinogen to pepsin. Okay, and pepsin chemically the denatured protein. Okay, so let's go through that. Chief cells are going to secrete pepsinogen, which is an inactive precursor to pepsin. Okay, so it secretes pepsinogen. Hydrochloric acid helps to convert it into pepsin. Pepsin then finishes the chemical digestion of protein. Now, pepsinogen is not only converted to pepsin. What did I say that? Pepsinogen is not only converted to pepsin by the low pH of the hydrochloric acid, but it can also be converted to pepsin with other pepsin that is already in the stomach. Now, what am I saying on this one? In addition to hydrochloric acid converts pepsinogen into pepsin. Okay, so that's one way to get to pepsin. The other way to take the pepsinogen, the inactive form of pepsin, you take pepsinogen, another way to activate it is by other pepsin that's already in the stomach, and then that will convert the pepsinogen into more pepsin. Okay? And then the last one the 5th one is G cells. And G cells are the hormones, so these are going to be at the very bottom on here. So that's a G cell. And this one is actually secreting gastrin. It's a hormone. And gastrin stimulates stomach motility, so it gets it moving a little bit more, and it stimulates more secretions for the stomach. So food enters your stomach, gastrin says, okay, let's start churning things up, and let's start secreting more stuff into the stomach. Okay? So now let's kind of put it together and look at it a little bit closer here. So the orange ones, this is going to be the surface mucus cells. That's going to secrete the alkaline mucus, which kind of protects it. Then we have the other mucus cells, which is mucus neck cells, and these are acidic secretions. Okay. Then we're going to go down to parietal cells. Parietal cells will secrete intrinsic factor, only essential function of the kidney. So definitely know that one. It secretes hydrogen ions and chloride ions. And if you follow these arrows, let me go to green on this one. If you follow the hydrogen and chloride, it gets to hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid basically helps to convert pepsinogen into pepsin. Pepsin helps to further break down the proteins. The hydrochloric acid also denatures protein. So you can see here's a big wound up protein, and now this is kind of an unwound protein, smaller strands. The pepsin then goes after the denatured proteins and then breaks them down even further. Okay. Chief cells. When we're looking at chief cells is what's secreting the pepsinogen on here. Chief cells also secrete, I don't know if I said this, gastric lipase, and it's just a smaller function. It helps to digest about 10 to 15% of your ingested fat. That's a smaller function of the chief cells, but gastric lipase is also one of those. And the G cells way at the bottom, as you can see, those gastric secretions are going in the opposite direction. Everything else is going up into the lumen. The G cells, or gastrin, gets into the bloodstream, and then that controls the other functions. So those are the different secretions of your stomach. So stay tuned for the next one.